I work for a charity, so the first thing I have to do is give a sales pitch for my charity. It goes with the territory. So the Progress Educational Trust is an organisation which does public engagement and policy work in the areas of assisted conception, genetics, and stem cell and embryo research. So as it's already been mentioned this morning a few times, mitochondria has been looming large on every minute of my waking and sleeping, actually, at the moment, because the House of Commons are due to vote as to whether to permit regulations to allow these treatments in the UK on Tuesday. So it's getting to be very exciting times. But the thing that perhaps people know us best for is BioNews, which is free to subscribe to, and for people who work in this sector, I'd say it's an invaluable tool to keep you up to date with what's going on in one quick email. It's totally free. You don't get any other emails about anything else. It's very, very simple. I don't know quite what happened there, but my slides moved on. I didn't touch anything. No.
I probably disturbed it when I got it on the ground. Apologies.
Anyway, but I'm here today really to talk to you with my fertility fairness hat on. And so fertility fairness, it's a new name. It formerly was the National Infertility Awareness Campaign, which was operating for about 20 years. And the other thing that's new about fertility fairness is that there are two new chairs. One is me, and the other is Susan Seenan from the charity Infertility Network, which many of you will be familiar with because they're the leading patient support group in the UK. And the other thing which is new and which I'll come to turn to later is the data that we've collected. Now, as many of you will know, when you're doing a rebrand of something, you don't chuck the baby out with the bathwater, you try and retain the good things. So we have the same objectives, which is fair and equitable access to NHS treatment for all those who are eligible. And we have the same supporters, because fertility fairness is an umbrella group. So there are lots of other bodies who believe in the same overarching goal. So the reason that we chose the name fertility fairness was because we really wanted something with the word fairness in. And the dictionary definition just sort of perfectly matched with our objectives. The quality of treating people equally or in a way that's right or reasonable, treating them in a way that's free from discrimination and in conformity with rules and standards. Now, all too often, fertility services are regarded as what is called in the NHS a Cinderella service. So that means one that's neglected or ignored or something that's given very little attention to. And I had to use this image of Cinderella because it's from the Ladybird book, which I had, and it's probably tattered still somewhere at my mum's in the loft or something. And this is perhaps indicative of me and Susan with our never-ending job of trying to improve the situation. So to sort of think back, in 2004, gosh, Facebook was launched. Where would we be without it? Tony Blair was still Prime Minister. Manchester United beat Millwall in the FA Cup final. That's not going to happen this year because they were knocked out last week to Cambridge United. That was a painful experience for me. And the Gherkin building was opened, which is now a very familiar part of the London skyline, and we don't really think about it anymore. We all talk about the cheese grater or the walkie-talkie, and the Gherkin's sort of old news. But the NICE guideline was published, and it was that that gave great hope to people, to patients and people who work in the NHS in the sector, that at last fertility treatment would be taken seriously. And the main, I'd say, message in that guideline was that for the provision of 3 full cycles of IVF. Now, I'm going to sort of go through what 3 full cycles of IVF is, even though probably most people in this room understand what it is. But it's really important that everyone understands what it is because commissioners don't. And they're the ones who make the decisions. So in a cycle of IVF, the ovaries are stimulated, The eggs are harvested and fertilised, developed into embryos. One embryo, mostly now one embryo is put back, and the rest are cryopreserved in some way and used in later treatment. And so if the fresh cycle doesn't work, then a frozen cycle is attempted, and then depending what other embryos are left, that continues until those embryos, the viable ones, have been used. And so then a second cycle of IVF would start again with a new stimulation. And then a third. And that's what the NICE guideline says. So 3 cycles of IVF is important because it maximises not only the clinical chances of pregnancy, but represents the most cost-effective use of resources. Some couples may not produce lots of embryos in their cycle. And so limiting them to just one full cycle can have a real impact on their chances of a successful pregnancy. So that is why it's so important. But what we found since 2004 is that many, whether it's PCTs before, primary care trusts, or whether it's clinical commissioning groups, which it is now, don't understand this definition of a cycle. So now I'm going to take you through a whistle-stop tour of the UK to tell you who gets what where. Well, sort of. So in Scotland, this is really the good news story. The government set up the Scottish National Infertility Group. There was an investment by government to reduce waiting lists for fertility treatment. They developed standard criteria. There was a recommendation for 3 full cycles, but their priority, they decided, was to reduce the waiting lists for fertility treatment. And so the initial funding was for 2 full cycles, and they reconvened in December last year to consider moving to 3 full cycles and to discuss whether, if couples have children from existing relationships or have adopted children, whether they should be allowed to access treatment. So we're waiting for those decisions. So that's Scotland. And the next country we'll turn to now is Wales. So Wales, there, the eligibility criteria are based on the NICE recommendations. There are standard criteria. There have been 2 full cycles allowed in Wales since 2010, and 1 full cycle where the woman is aged 40 to 42. And the priority now for our work in Wales is to push for 3 full cycles. We hop over the water to Northern Ireland, where there is 1 fresh plus 1 frozen transfer allowed where the woman's under 40. And so there is still quite a lot of work to be done in Northern Ireland to improve the situation. But one piece of good news for people in Northern Ireland is that existing children for them aren't a barrier to treatment. That's not one of the criteria that's been introduced there. So far, fairly straightforward. Then we move to England. Oh dear. So England, this is where the the NICE guideline really should apply, because NICE is a UK, although they're often used throughout the whole of the UK, they're really should govern what happens in England. However, we have a situation where we have totally inequitable and unfair access to NHS treatment with variable criteria set by the clinical commissioning groups. And as I've said, some CCGs are still wrongly defining a cycle. And so we have what's been commonly dubbed in the UK as a postcode lottery. And for those of you from outside the UK who might not be familiar with this term, it's where your address dictates what treatment you receive. And I found this cartoon and I just absolutely love it. I haven't shown it to my co-chair yet. But this is sometimes what it feels like when we're dealing with clinical commissioning groups, is that, oh, well, hey, we've not thought of this. Let's introduce this, and that can then somehow act as, I would argue, a rationing tool for people for treatment. And it's, they don't even bother, some of them, you feel, to look at the NICE guideline. So in England, we have 211 of these clinical commissioning groups, and they're all making pretty much their own decisions. A lot of them act independently of one another. Some will come together and make their decisions, or they'll try to make a sort of perhaps a policy decision for an area, but then they'll each go off into their individual groups and discuss it and then come up with their policy. So you can see perhaps where a lot of money goes and time taken up actually making these decisions, you might think. So no one is monitoring the provision of fertility services in the UK, and so Fertility Fairness decided a good use of our time would be in gathering the data. And I have to really pay a great tribute to the Secretariat of the group, because they issued freedom of information requests to all the clinical commissioning groups, and they had responses from 210 out of 211, which is pretty good going. And we asked them a range of questions. And this is sort of part of the headline data. So you can see that 52% only offer one cycle of IVF, and only 18% are offering 3 cycles. So there's room for a lot of improvement there. And some of the other key findings that we discovered were that there was this reduction in cycles since the last survey had been taken, and that just over the course of Parliament as a whole, there was a trend of reduction. And one thing that we hadn't looked at before that we looked at last year, and I should say this data was accurate at June last year, and it's a bit like painting the Forth Bridge, it changes all the time on a sort of weekly basis, was that there's a significant variation in cost. And this was actually, it was surprising in some ways. It was not surprising, but I think that the variation in scale was what surprised me most. So that some commissioners, when asked how much they were paying for a cycle of IVF, were saying 2,900, and others were saying 6,000. So that's quite a large margin. Now, if we actually took away the outliers, so there were some that were saying they were paying £10,000 a cycle, and some that were saying they were paying £1,300 odd pounds a cycle. So when you put those back in, it becomes even more alarming. But we decided with the outliers, perhaps they didn't quite understand the question in some way and they were getting confused. Because what we've also found is that when some clinical commissioning groups are putting out public consultations as to what they should be doing, because they like to ask the public what they should be spending the money on, you see some of them include figures and saying how much they spend on the treatment. And so sometimes we FOI them to try and get to the bottom of those figures, because a group of 5 of us can't understand them, or we think, are we just being really thick here? And with one group, I won't name them, we FOI'd them 3 times about the figures, because we still couldn't understand it even when we got the explanation, or sort of explanation. And the final response was, it's a bit like the dog ate my homework. They seem to have lost their original workings out. You think, well, how can that happen, and how can that be the basis to be making or putting information in a public consultation? It's not quite right. Well, it's just not right at all. The other thing that we discovered was that 2 clinical commissioning groups were offering no funding at all for IVF. Now, prior to that, everyone thought there was just one bad guy in England, the Vale of York, but Sutton had actually slipped under the radar and obviously hadn't made a song and dance about it in the media, but that came to light as a result of this. And we also discovered that 7 areas were claiming they'd funded 3 cycles, when in fact they didn't. It wasn't actually the proper definition of a cycle, and that's why the definition of a cycle is so important. So that was our data. So since then, NICE published a quality standard. Now, what's a quality standard, you may ask? Well, I did ask myself that. But it's the next step that NICE can take after publishing a guideline to serve as a reminder to commissioners and funding bodies about what they should be doing. I suppose it's a sort of shorthand in a way, so that rather than have to read through a great weighty guideline of several hundred pages, there's a short condensed paper that they can find. And so quality standard reiterated what was in the guideline. And this was the quote that came from the Deputy Chief Exec of NICE with that guideline. And I'm not going to read it out, but I was delighted, because that was the sort of thing I'd have written if I was writing their press statement. So that was fantastic news for us. And what was also great news for us was that they used our data in their press release as well for fertility fairness. So it was a great sort of feeling that all that work we'd done in collating all that information had been useful and had been recognised by NICE. So, and what was interesting is when the British Medical Journal reported on this development by NICE, they said that they'd actually done an investigation into this area themselves in 2013. And they'd done it because in 2013 NICE refreshed their guideline and updated it, and they actually extended the provision of fertility services to women over 40 who fulfill certain criteria. So women between 40 and 42 that had, well, it's quite a long checklist of things that they have to have and haven't done, could qualify for fertility treatment on the NHS. And when the BMJ looked at this back in 2013, they found that actually only 4 out of 195 responses that they got had actually started treating women in that age group. Now, some recent changes since we did our survey. And so some areas, some good news here. So some areas, those at the top are in Yorkshire, have reintroduced funding, and in Cheshire and Merseyside, they're shifting from 2 to 3, and I think that's confirmed now. And then the sort of southeast of England are looking at extending from 1 fresh cycle. And then there's the Vale of York. You might remember I just mentioned them earlier. They were the bad guy. Well, they made an announcement in June last year that they would be considering introducing funding. Hurrah! Only 1 cycle, but, you know, the Vale of York, there's an expression, out is better than nout up north. And so that was at least something. But unfortunately, about a month later, when their board met, they voted that they wouldn't be introducing any fertility treatment at all. And this was sort of made even more annoying because it was a very close vote, 5 to 4, but one person didn't vote because they were thinking of running for Parliament at this election. And so they thought they would be conflicted, and so decided not to vote. So it was disillusionment all round. And the thing is, when these statements are being released in the media like this, you know, couples, it's their hopes and dreams and their family planning that are riding on these things. So one minute you're thinking, great, we might be able to access some treatment on the NHS. You know, in that month you could have planned a holiday and spent some of your money that you were actually saving. You know, it's very, very difficult. But it ended up now being a good news story because in December, which I wasn't expecting, I have to say, they decided that they would reintroduce funding 1 cycle with immediate effect. So ultimately a good news story. Still a long way to go there, but as I said, out is better than nout. So those are the good news. However, Mid-Essex has stopped funding. They were funding 3 cycles. Now they're only going to fund treatment in exceptional cases. I don't know what an exceptional case of infertility is. I suspect probably most couples who come to see you guys think they're exceptional. I thought I was exceptional when I was a fertility patient, I have to say. Bedfordshire have dropped from 3 cycles to 1. And again, in the east of England, there's been a decrease in funding from 3 cycles to 2. They were held up as the sort of gold standard in the east of England. And one of the things that's been concerning about this trend of this decrease is that rather than use the NICE evidence and their very recent review, they commissioned some of their own research, which was done on a much smaller scale. And I know at least one person who was on the NICE guideline committee is in the audience. It's a huge piece of work that they undertake when they come to these decisions. So to substitute it for something that a few people have done on a small scale is not really appropriate. Now, trying to keep up with what's going on with all these clinical commissioning groups, my favourite metaphor for this is it's like playing the game whack-a-mole. Because the minute you sort of think you've sorted out one, another's popped up somewhere else. And this is just to give you an indication of what's happening at the moment, just in one area. So all these decisions are expected to come out at some point. Now, often it's not a big announcement in the media. Sometimes it's not on their website, or if it is on their website, it will be buried in minutes of a board meeting. So trying to keep on top of this information is a job of work in itself. And I do know that the decision has been made for Portsmouth, and they've decided to go from one fresh cycle to one fresh and then add one frozen in. And I think what's interesting about this is when you sort of read the minutes and see what's been said. They say the Priorities Committee, so the sort of, it's sort of a Priorities Committee, sounds a bit of a strange name for a committee, decided that the evidence did support funding one more embryo transfer, but it didn't support an upward extension of the age limit or the funding of additional full cycles of treatment. And, it seems, when you read more of it, that it's another example of a commissioning group overruling the NICE evidence. So what would be fair? Full implementation of the NICE guideline and quality standard, standard eligibility criteria across England, 3 full cycles. A national tariff, I think, would be a good idea, because if there was clarity in the amount that the commissioners knew they were paying, then they would be able to budget with greater certainty. And this is really important when commissioners give as their biggest reason for not funding services the price. And a clinical commissioning group outcome indicator for fertility services, and I'll come on to speak about that a bit more in a moment. And how you can help, because that's important. You can update us on potential changes in your area, help me whack those moles. I'd very much appreciate that. You can push for a robust process of review, which involves clinicians, health professionals and patients. It's important that you, who work in the sector, make your voices heard here. You could help highlight best practices to your clinical commissioning groups, and you can tell your patients about fertility fairness. You can ask your patients if they will complain by writing to their MP about fair and equitable access to treatment or tweeting them. And you can sign the e-petition that we have on the Fertility Fairness website and ask others to do the same. And the Clinical Commissioning Group Outcomes Indicator set, that has been announced this week, and the response date is the 23rd of February. Now, the outcome indicators, it's so complicated. Does anyone know what an outcome indicator is in this room? No, didn't think so. So it's another way that NICE can assist in the commissioning process. And so the aim of them is to set clear and comparative information for clinical commissioning groups, to help them identify local priorities for quality improvement and to demonstrate that progress in local health systems is being made and that outcomes are improving. So it's something that can be measured at clinical commissioning group level. So, and it's a tool. It's a tool for clinical commissioning groups to drive local improvement and set their priorities. Now, there are 3 different indicators that NICE are consulting on here, and my understanding on reading it is that they will implement one. And the one that I think of the 3 that is the most important is for the 3 full cycles of IVF for women under 40, because that is the one that stands to benefit, I think, the most patients. One of the other ones is for the 1 cycle for women over 40 to 42. That's great, but what we have noticed is that where clinical commissioning groups have introduced services for the older women, they've reduced it for the younger women in a sort of horse trading exercise and said, well, we can't afford that, when actually the number of older women who would qualify with all the criteria is actually very small. And so we're not talking about huge additions to the budget in treating these older women. So if you are minded to respond, then that is the one that I would urge you to put your voice behind. And I was just going to, for devilment, made this slide really, because I can see James Lawford Davis at the back, who's going to be talking about this later, is that when I do media around full fertility fairness, the question I get asked every time, whether it's local radio, drive time, BBC, whoever, is there a right to have a baby? And I say probably different things every time, but I've been thinking about it more, and I actually now think I'm just going to say that's the wrong question. Is there a right to access medical treatment? Yes. There's a right to access medical treatment which can help you conceive. And I've got my picture of Cinderella again, because I'm not asking to marry Prince Charming and to live happily ever after. I'm asking for the chance of getting a pumpkin and going to the ball and having that chance, and not to have it closed off to me and be still in the kitchen scrubbing the floor. So here are ways that you can get involved, things that you can point your patients to, and follow on Twitter, etc., etc. So thank you very much for your time.